Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome back to the show. Wanted to do a brief discussion on the tariffs because it's blowing up the markets and it's blowing up the news. I'm not an economist. I'm not an expert. I used to be an entrepreneur, kind of retired now, except for my Patreon, which is linked down below. But I want to talk about some things that you could do to be prepared for what's happening and give you a little context as I understand it. Again, I'm not an economist, not an expert, but I do understand a little bit about what's going on. So, the tariff, the tax. Now, in the short term, we're going to be grossly impacted by this. We're going to feel the pain. Right now, a lot of economists think we're headed into a recession, but we won't know about that recession for at least 7 months. On average, that's how long it takes. Now, what is a recession to you? Well, across the field, across multiple industries, from interest rates, mortgage loans, to consumer goods, the list goes on, you will be impacted by those things. And then when you look at the burn rate over a period of 7 months, they'll determine, yeah, we were in a recession or we are currently in a recession. And we won't find out about that until the end of the year. Now, one of the things the mainstream media, especially on the left, is not discussing is the detriment or the fallout of what happens if we don't do anything about our current situation. I mean, it's comical to me that we have a government efficiency organization that is looking at fraud, waste, and abuse and identifying at every opportunity they go in, at a minimum, it's $1 billion of abuse. And they're trying to cut $1 trillion by the end of September, the government fiscal year running from October to October. Why? Because we're running $30+ trillion in national debt. We're paying about $1 trillion a year on the interest on that debt, and we can't survive. A good analogy, as I heard it, was that we're running 600 different government organizations. We're running 11,000 different funds that are allocated a budget, and we have all of these, call them debit cards, but they're really credit cards because we're running the debt up, disseminated throughout the government, and nobody's tracking what's going out or what's coming in. And that's a significant issue. If we're not tracking where the money's going, then we're recklessly spending. We're just spending and spending. We're outpouring a major component to our stability, our self-reliance. And at the end of it, by 2032, the estimates are for Social Security, for example, it would be bankrupt. And so people are saying Doge is cutting Social Security. And the reality is they're not cutting Social Security at all. They're cutting the fraud, waste, and abuse. I think the reality is a lot of the bureaucrats are afraid of being exposed because, as Elon just discussed over the last couple of days, they're going to expose, for example, the 450,000 Social Security numbers given to illegals who are collecting benefits and illegally voting. But why would the bureaucrat want to stop that? Well, because if they scratch the surface and peel back the onion enough, they're going to be in tears, because the reality is a lot of them are circumnavigating that money in a big laundering scheme, especially to NGOs where the person in charge doesn't even know they're getting the money, and then all of that money is unaccounted for. And we're not talking about a couple $100,000. We're talking about billions of dollars. The reality is, if we don't do something very aggressive about this situation, we're going to be bankrupt completely. And that's what these guys are trying to stop right now. Again, they're complaining a lot. The left is reporting all of this doom and gloom, but we're not providing any solutions. And I think that's the overall major issue that I'm seeing, because we actually have a solution here and a plan. Now, it's scary. Even when I look at it, I go, oh, the market just crashed. That's a huge problem. But what does that mean to you? Okay, so Liberation Day, they outlined in an 8-page document what we're being taxed or tariffed versus other countries, right? So if you're, for example, South Korea, which I talked about in the YouTube video, the last YouTube video, South Korea, for example, is exporting rice to America because there's a lot of rice paddies in South Korea. When you look at South Korea exports and how much they're charging us versus how much we are charging them for the imported goods, it's not balanced. So we want to balance the books. Now, what we do, I think, the administration is doing, what Trump is doing specifically, because he knows how to do this in a business deal, is he is basically saying, hey, this is how it's going to work. you're going to grossly impact your economy and your people, your national security even, if you don't come to the negotiation table and navigate this with us. For example, Canada is coming out right now and saying, hey, let's just do 0 for 0. That's probably not going to work for America, or at least the Trump administration. But they're saying those things because the short-term reality is if these countries don't step up and correct course, they're going to impact their own economies. And sure, they'll talk the big talk via their representative, mostly their state representative, but you better believe the Department of Commerce or the Ministry of Commerce is going, hey, the economics don't look good. So, for example, if you're in the automotive industry and you have a car that's being imported here from Ford that was produced in Mexico, you're going to get hit with a 25% tax on top of that. Now, a lot of, especially the leftist media, is saying that's going to grossly impact the consumer. Sure, if you're dumb enough to pay 25% more for a new vehicle from Ford. Or here's an idea. The consumer says, I'm not paying 25% more. And then the company goes, we're not making sales. What's this look like long term? Oh, we'll be out of business. Well, maybe we should move manufacturing back to the US. And that's the overall goal. You see, because in this analogy of the 50% and below, the middle class to being impoverished in this country, which is not really being impoverished because the subsidies from the government pick up that government cheese. When you look at 50% and below, the working middle class, they're the one who have lost everything. They're the ones who have had the factory jobs in their communities, like the Firestone factory, the tire factories in North Carolina that I saw firsthand impact Red Springs, Hope Mills, Fayetteville, and create more poverty because these consumers continue to buy the tires. Oh, and guess what? They're going to get it cheaper because the factory, the company that did the numbers navigated they can make more money by moving the stuff overseas. And there was no incentive for them to stay in the US because the tariffs weren't balanced. So the overall objective is to bring the jobs back to the working class, the middle class. And you see everybody above that, let's call it 60 to 100%, especially the top 10%, they continue to get more wealthy. And why would you ask? Well, because they gotten away with outsourcing all the jobs overseas, which have reduced the overall price, increased their profit margins. Now they're making more money and they're making a lot more money. So again, there's no incentive for them to bring the job back unless there's a tariff. And now let's look at the cons of this. Well, if you're looking at an automotive vehicle, for example, a lot of automotive vehicles can be manufactured here without the tariff using overseas components. Because some of these components you're not going to be able to make in the US because we don't have the expertise. The fear from my perspective is a lot of these industries are requiring very specific components in a collective to be able to sell the consumer good. So if you bring all of those specific components to the US, well, every component becomes more expensive and then the device becomes out of range for the consumer, even in the United States. There will be, sure, some people who pay for it. But for example, if you take an electronic device and the entire thing is made in the US, you're going to pay a premium on that electronic device. That's not the biggest concern because there are ways to navigate that. You can make the components overseas. We can reduce it because, for example, chips can be excluded or unconstrained from the tariff, and they could be funneled in to be put into vehicles, PCUs, computers, cell phones, etc. The overall issue is the consumer is going to eat the price up front, right? Especially if they want to pay for it. If they don't pay for it, they nearly put the manufacturer out of business. What you might see is some of these businesses holding to the point in which they might go out of business. That's not the most dangerous course of action. The most dangerous course of action here is the fact that this will take a lot of time because you have to build the factory. That takes time. You have to train the workers. That builds time. You have to go from an export or an import from your country's perspective, bringing it into the US, to now changing it to a domestic protocol. Well, if the tariff is immediate, which it mostly is immediate, it just happened yesterday at midnight, then you're going to see those prices continue to rise and no relief for the American consumer overall. The markets are feeling that uncertainty right now, I can tell you that. And for sure, the consumers are going to get hit with it. Now, I'll just give you one pro tip. I talk about this in the underground on my Patreon. For example, a market that I know a lot about, the used vehicle market. I've bought and sold vehicles, used vehicles, without a dealer license, just doing it as like a hobby to even put myself through college in my break-in service in the early 2000s, where I was trying to go back in the military. I had the GI Bill, but I wasn't making enough to even pay for my expenses, like groceries, for example. I was buying used vehicles, really cheap off eBay, parting them out, and then making a couple grand on that return investment, which would take me about a week to break down, at the time, RX-7s. Well, let me give an example of something that happened and we identified during the pandemic. We have no self-reliance because we're outsourcing everything. We're outsourcing the pharmaceutical ingredients to make the drug, and we have the capsule here, but we don't have the ingredients, and that hurts us. Well, a lot of these industries, for example, that are going to be impacted, like the automotive industry, even in the midterm, over the course of the next year, what happens, just like what happened during the pandemic? Well, their entire stockpile of inventory, which I could see right down the road at the Dodge dealership, is influx with vehicles that are 20, 30% more expensive than they were during the pandemic or before pandemic. Post, the 30% more. Why? Because they have all the inventory they invested and they didn't make any sales during because they were out of stock. Now they're backlogged in inventory. Now what happens when the logistic train shows up, puts the vehicle on, and it's 25% more? Well, they're going to throw the price tag adjustment on you. Well, is anybody going to buy that? The answer is no. So what happens to the used vehicle industry? And I feel a little guilty putting this out here because I talk about this on my Patreon on the underground, giving very specific tactics of what to do. But I also know that putting this out there is going to make people start to hold or potentially buy. Right now would be a great time to buy a used vehicle cash, especially a used vehicle that has the proof of resale value or not depreciating. Because, for example, if you buy a Toyota Camry, which is a best-selling vehicle, you're going to take that Camry now, buy it for $5,000, and likely in 6 months, maybe even sooner, maybe 90 days, be able to sell that vehicle at a premium. Now, with that being said, you might see prices jack up right now through the roof. All of a sudden, I have a whole bunch of people trying to buy my truck that I put on the market yesterday. So that's telling me like, oh, people are paying attention to this and they're taking their allocation of their resources, their cash that is diminishing in value by the day because of the whack, fraud, waste, and abuse in the government that's complaining but has no solutions. And you're taking that money now and investing it into used vehicles, which is going to benefit you long term. So it's the time to buy. It might even be the time to sell. Because if you, for example, have a vehicle that's worth $5,000, you sell it for $7,000, you're likely going to get somebody to take the bait. Because the reality is the dealerships are going to go out in troves and try to buy up the used market. They're already doing that. I get email requests all the time saying, hey, you have this vehicle, it's 2 years old, you bought it from us new, we would give you a premium on it. Of course they would. Because they would take a $5,000 blue booked vehicle, pay you $7,500 and flip it on their lot for $10,000. And what is that going to do to the entire automotive industry? It's going to create a lot of issues, but you might be able to benefit from that. And again, if you're taking the allocation of cash and investing it into these type of deals, be smart with your investment. Don't take the cash that you sell the vehicle for $7,500. It might be even more intelligent to hold. But if you do sell, take that and reallocate it to somewhere that's going to be of potential better use. I don't know, like guns and ammo. That rarely depreciates. Just putting it out there. Guys, if you check out my Patreon, we talk about this in depth. We have specific tactics that we talk about. I just am dropping the video, the tariffs and fragile market and tactics to help. Overall, in conclusion, here's what I think is going on. Somebody has to make the hard decision. because they have a plan. The Trump administration has a plan. Every talking head that you see running their mouth and complaining, they don't have a plan. They don't have a solution. Their only solution via their own brand now is to complain and just say, scream and yell at the top of their lungs, doom and gloom. That's the only thing they're doing. Propagandizing radical extremism mostly on the left and how we're going to fall apart and sink into the ocean. Well, here's the reality. If we don't do something right now, which the Trump administration is doing, then we're going to be bankrupt at the end of this. Whether it's Doge and building efficiency into a reckless spending system, capturing those bureaucrats who are circumnavigating the system and making their pocketbooks line to hundreds of millions of dollars. Pretty funny because the average salary is $175K. Or having sound economic tactics that take some time to come to fruition. Short term, it's going to hurt. Long term, we're going to be better off as a society. Remember that. I appreciate you guys. Till next time, check me out in the underground. Also, link my book down below. And I got a Sweat Tent shout out. Sweat Tent, not sponsored by them, but I do have a discount code. I get an affiliate kickback if you use Glover, just one word Glover, where you can save 10 to 15% off in the links down below. Till next time, peace out, guys.